So in the last lesson, we took our cart object literal and then refactored things across to a constructor function. We then discussed the prototype and the prototype chain, or this prototype object, which comes with all of our objects, functions, arrays, strings, and everything in JavaScript. So this is a nice way that we can inspect what is happening. Now, in this video, what we want to do is migrate our code to a new format. Now, everything that I've just highlighted is going to change. The implementation and how we use them, such as our new cart call, is going to stay the exact same, as well as any methods or perhaps property access as well. Now, what we're about to learn is how to change our constructor function and these prototype methods, which, as you can see, aren't really tied together. We could have things in different files and it becomes a bit more difficult to kind of manage and potentially expand. So this is the idea, to bring this class keyword over to JavaScript. So this would give us something like this, where we have class cart, and we would use these curly braces to start the beginning and close off our class. Now, I've deliberately removed the function call because we are creating a class, and a class is something that beholds the behavior as well as data, which in our case is our items. Now, in ES 2015, this class keyword was introduced, and we're using Babel to then compile down to ES5 from our code, which is ES 2015. Now, some browsers fully support classes, so you don't technically need to compile them, but to support some older projects, you definitely will need to, which we're also doing in our case here. Now, inside a class, we don't typically want to have this.items floating around. So instead of having a function that we would treat as a constructor function, the class actually ships with the word constructor. So what we can do is paste in our items that we took from our constructor function, and essentially anything that we want to initialize, such as this.items, we can then drop inside of our constructor. So this is what a class blueprint looks like. We have the name of the class, we have the opening body of the class. Anything that we want to initialize, such as when we pass things down into our cart, if we wanted to perhaps initialize it with some data, the way that we can grab that is through this constructor. Everything else pretty much is the same in the way that we can specify default parameters for our constructor, and we're just binding to this.items. Now, at the moment, we need to actually create the reference to this.items. And this is typically done via something like this, where any properties that we would use, it's a good practice to also include them up here as well. Now, instead of having cart.prototype.add equals function, we can in fact move these to a method on the class itself. Now, the nice thing about a class is when we were dealing with object literals, we had to remember to add our commas and all these different types of things in as well. Now, because a class is a new construct in JavaScript, it has a very nice syntax. We don't need to include commas or semicolons to separate things, and we can use the shorthand function syntax when creating our methods. So this add that we've just added here is essentially going to compile out to exactly what we had before. So that's a key consideration and thing to remember. We'll also do the same with our remove function. We'll go ahead and just refactor this out. And when we go and remove our before code, we should save things out, and we can see that, in fact, nothing has changed. So let's expand this. You can see that we have items. It's not giving us add or remove our functions as top-level properties. We do, in fact, inherit them from the prototype. So this code that we've just written is, in a sense, absolutely identical. It is just sugar syntax for the old prototype style that we used to have. With ES 2015, there were a lot of great improvements introduced to the JavaScript language, and classes have been one of them, or at least to some people. There are many JavaScript developers, or just developers in general, who don't think that the class keyword should exist because it's not technically a true class in JavaScript, because we rely on the underworkings of prototypal inheritance. So in other languages, a class is slightly different, and in JavaScript, we are still compiling down to prototypal inheritance. And even if we are, in fact, using the browser's built-in classes, underneath it's still going to be using prototypes. So there's no magic happening. It is prototypes, which is why we've kind of expanded our knowledge. We've gone from object literals to understanding prototypes, and now how they apply to classes and constructor functions. So the great thing about this class is it's all in one declaration. There's no add or remove floating around. I've got my constructor, which I can go and reference and find quite easily. I can see what's happening. Whereas beforehand, it wasn't obvious that my function of cart was in fact intended to be some kind of constructor. Now with the class, that is made far easier. So that's it for this video. I think this is a really nice progression for us in learning the ES5 methods first, and then looking at ES 2015 or ES6, if you will, the class equivalent of what we've done before. It might be that you have a perfectly valid use case to be using the old constructor method if you really want to, but nowadays we should adopt this class-based approach. But there are many tutorials out there that don't tell you all you need to know, which we've gone through about proto, the prototype chain, and how to create our own constructor functions, and then how they apply to these classes. I think you can agree that if you dived straight into classes, there would be a lot of knowledge that we've perhaps forgotten and skipped over. And also it makes things more difficult when we try to explain this prototype because we cannot actually see the prototype because this is a new language construct. So that's it for this video. Just remember that they are pretty much the same, and a class gives us some nice syntactic sugar. We can also, if we're using JavaScript modules, for example, use things like the export keyword next to them to export classes to be able to import them elsewhere in our project.